Well, whether or not Republicans win the House, it's worth noting that the circumstances and strength of President-elect Trump's power in the Republican Party are vastly different than when he won the last time. The Trump skeptics who controlled the House and Senate Republican conferences have been replaced by individuals who owe their standing to Trump. And from top to bottom, today's Republican Party is largely built in Trump's image. So is the Supreme Court, which significantly expanded the scope of presidential power by ruling that all presidents now have absolute immunity for official acts. Joining me now on set is NBC News senior national politics reporter Sahil Kapur and Stephen Hayes, editor of The Dispatch and an NBC News contributor. Thanks to both of you for being here. So, Sahil, I spoke with President-elect Trump. He said he believes he has a mandate to bring common sense back to the country. What do you make of that?
Well, the biggest question is how much power the president is going to have through Congress. Now, you talk to him a lot about the border. He can do some of that by himself through executive action, reimpose the policies that he put in that President Biden unraveled. He can do a lot on tariffs by himself as well through executive action. But the things he's going to need Congress for, money to carry out a lot of those things. He's going to need a Republican Congress to give him money if he wants to do mass deportation. Going to need a whole lot more money for that. And two of the biggest questions right now are the size of his House majority. Republicans have not clinched the House yet, but they're on pace to have a narrow majority. It's not going to be a big majority, smaller than his 2017 one. And then, of course, the Senate, the filibuster is still there for any wholesale regulatory changes that he would like to make.
Well, Stephen, I talked to the president-elect about the House. He seemed very bullish as well. Obviously, the numbers show that he will have control of, that Republicans will have control of the House ultimately. What do you make of that extraordinary sort of expansion of power, the fact that Republicans will control now the White House and both chambers of Congress, and that ideologically, at least, there is a conservative tilt to the Supreme Court?
Yeah, I mean, two main points. The first is to echo the point that you just made. It's different now than it was in 2017. Yeah. The people who are Trump skeptics, and were Trump skeptics in 2017, many of them have left Congress. There was always this group of members of Congress who would talk to people like the three of us quietly on the side and say, well, this is what he's saying, this is what I'm saying publicly, and I'm saying something a little bit different privately. Yeah. But now, as you point out, a lot of these people are here because of Donald Trump, because of their loyalty to Donald Trump. They ran on his issues, and I think you can expect them to be loyal. One of the biggest questions I have about this new Washington, D.C., how many of those people who are really not with him are sort of old school conservatives will be willing to speak up in this Trump-dominated environment. And then the second point I would make just quickly on the House, I think we're going to come to look at the House as the tool for Donald Trump's retribution agenda. He ran on retribution for 3 years. He meant it. I think we should assume that he meant it. And the House, particularly with the Oversight Committee and with the power that they have to subpoena and to go after, for instance, the January 6th committee and the January 6th committee members that they didn't like, I think that's the place where a lot of those investigations will take place.
Sahil, pick up on that point. I mean, do you see it playing out in the House? Is that where this retribution agenda is going to take place?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think that's why the stakes for the House are so massive, especially when you know that President Trump is going to be in the White House with a Republican-led Senate. It's either going to be in the hands of Speaker Mike Johnson or someone else who is very loyal to Donald Trump, or he's going to have to be dealing with a potential Speaker, Hakeem Jeffries, who would use that power against the administration, at least to investigate the Trump administration. That power will be used very, very differently. And this, to Steve's point, this might prevent Trump from trying to use the Justice Department to go after his political enemies in ways that he suggested he would, which would be extremely controversial if he tried. It might come across a little bit differently if he, tweeted something and his political allies tried to pick up on it.
It's a great point. Let's talk about what we know so far about how the administration may or may not take shape. We're hearing Susie Wiles is one of the people who's being eyed as a potential chief of staff. There are other names on that list, but she obviously ran his campaign. A lot of people think it was his most disciplined campaign so far. We're also hearing about RFK Jr. He said himself that he's eyeing RFK Jr., Stephen, to come in and do health care. Elon Musk. What do you make of those names so far that and the list goes on and on? Marco Rubio, potentially for Secretary of Defense or National Security Advisor. What are you hearing?
Well, I mean, you've covered him as closely as anybody. None of this will matter until Donald Trump makes a decision. And he'll call all of his people and he'll say, what do you think about this? And he'll call people who appear on television and people he likes and trusts and say, what do you think about this? And then ultimately he'll make the decision. The interesting thing in, just 48 hours of making phone calls and trying to get a sense of like who's really part of this is everybody thinks they're the leading contender for these things. So they're all out, launching quiet campaigns. There was out external campaigns on behalf of Susie Wiles. You had Charlie Kirk, the right-wing media personality, agitating for her, pointing for her to get the job. We're going to see this. I mean, I think it's going to be like a series of campaigns, some of them subtle and behind the scenes, some of them quite open for people who want these plum jobs.
The one thing I'll predict is there will not be another John Kelly, another James Mattis, people who saw their job as being some, restraining some of his impulses that they thought were dangerous.
And what is the potential impact of that, Sahil? I mean, both on a practical matter, but also this is someone who likes to, what Trump world allies typically call spitball ideas with those who are in his cabinet, in his administration. What do you think functionally the potential impact of that is?
Well, the most important thing is there'll be loyalists that he'll stack his administration with. That matters when he's sitting around the table, the kind of advice he gets, whether people are going to tell him things he doesn't want to hear, whether people are going to disagree with him and make points in opposition. He did have that in his first term, whether or not he wanted it. There were a lot of people who he had to get through the Senate who were old school Republicans. This time around, whether it's 52 seats that we know he has, they might pad that margin a little bit. There are many fewer Senate Republicans who are going to be standing up to Trump.
I think I'd add another layer of nuance there. I think you have the Trump sycophants, these people who will do anything the president asks and probably push him to go further than he might instinctively want to go. You had the previous, the adults in the room, whatever we wanted to call them, the people who push back on those things. I think there's another category, and those are the people who are loyal to the president, who will do his bidding, but are also serious about world events and think about sort of big picture things and understand the threats from foreign adversaries. Somebody like a John Ratcliffe, who was DNI in the first term, but there was lots of reporting about John Ratcliffe in the days after the 2020 election when Trump was pushing Stop the Steal, quietly saying around the White House, hey, this is not a great idea. So somebody nobody doubts John Ratcliffe was loyal to Donald Trump. But there was a point at which he said, enough is enough. And I think there's a category of those kind of people. I'd put Marco Rubio in that category.
I was going to say Marco Rubio. Yeah, absolutely.
Rubio pushed back on some things in the first term. Kellogg, sometimes.
Last thing, if I can add,
please.
He will still have to deal with Democrats in Congress on some really big things. There's another round of government funding coming up. That is subject to the 60-vote threshold. He's going to need to kind of deal with them. There's another debt limit deadline coming up next year to prevent a global economic meltdown. He's going to have to deal with Democrats for that.
Well, you raised an interesting point, and one top Republican said to me that Republicans would be strategic to try to take some of those things off the table before the inauguration. Is there any realistic world where that could potentially get done?
Government funding? Probably not. They have a deadline coming up December 20th. It's highly unlikely they're going to come up with a deal, especially when they know they can rewrite the bill to their liking in the Trump administration. The debt limit deadline, certainly not. They're not going to pass another debt limit extension before that. So that's going to be a problem, at least a challenge that he's going to have to find a way around, in addition to his expiring tax cuts. More than $3 trillion of tax cuts at the end of next year.
Well, Stephen, I was going to give you the last word on tax cuts, because that's obviously one of his big campaign promises. He's going to extend the Trump-era tax cuts.
Something he ran on, and certainly something that Reagan-style old-school Republicans are also in favor of.
All right. Well, a lot to watch as this transition gets underway. Sahil, Stephen, great to see you both. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.